What am I looking at? Those were the same exact words I said to myself on my first trip to Cambodia. Hello and welcome to Angkor. When I first saw the temples of the Khmer, I didn't have a clue to their significance. All I saw were large piles of rocks with strange carvings on them, which meant nothing to me. I was so frustrated in my inability to understand what was in front of me that after I went home, I began to do some research. And I was determined on my next trip to Cambodia to better understand the society that had built such magnificent temples. Now, some years later, I think I finally understand a little of what I was seeing on my first trips to Cambodia. There are reasons, of course, why Khmer temples look like they do. And a lot of it has to do with Cambodia's ties with India. To better understand that, let's start with a little historical background. The indigenous peoples of Southeast Asia were originally animists who worshipped ancestral spirits and the denizens of the earth, sky, and water. With the beginning of the first millennium, trade routes in Asia expanded, and as a consequence of cultural contact with other areas of the world, in particular India, other religions such as Buddhism and Hinduism were introduced into Southeast Asia. This assimilation of Indian culture into Southeast Asia was called Indianization. The Silk Road, established about the 2nd century BCE, was not just one road, but a network of routes used to exchange silk, gold, spices, and other goods between China and kingdoms to the west, such as Rome, Egypt, and Greece. In addition to the main northern route, a southern branch reached as far as India and Southeast Asia. Along with the goods traded, the Silk Road was also a medium for cultural and technological exchange between nations, and inventions such as paper and gunpowder became widely known because of its existence. In addition to the overland route, there was also a maritime component, and because of the increasingly dangerous conditions on the overland route, the sea lanes between China and the West became more important over time. This shift to the south became very important to the development of Southeast Asia at the time. Merchant ships regularly stopped at Southeast Asian ports, such as Ak-Eo, on the way to and from China, which facilitated the introduction of new goods, religions, and technologies to areas which had previously been isolated. During the classical and early medieval periods of India, there were two distinct religious architectural styles. In the south was the Dravidian style. Dravidian temples were characterized by a pyramidal or stepped tower. In the north was the Nagara style. This was distinguished from the Dravidian style by a curvilinear or rounded type of tower and some other structural differences. A third type, the Visara style, was a hybrid of the other two. There were many of these Visara style temples throughout India. Although Buddhism was a major force in shaping Khmer religious history for most of the Angkorian period and the pre-Angkorian period, the religious structure of the Khmer was based on Hinduism. One might think then that the Khmer temples would resemble either the Nagara or the Dravidian styles of India. Due to the proclivity of the Khmer to change things to their own tastes, however, it's more likely that the Khmer temples would resemble the Visara style. One of the most important areas of Khmer temples, in the decorative sense, were their entrances, as these were the gateways for pilgrims and officiants of the temple to enter the holy place, which was the home of their god. Therefore, doorways received some of the most lavish decorations. On either side of the doorway stood pilasters and colonnettes. Above the doorways were pediments, and below these were the lintels. Lintels are particularly important to scholars of Khmer history for several reasons. First, they are integral parts of temple structure and are not easily removed. This means that many lintels still remain in place. Secondly, lintels' decorative styles changed over time, which means that once the stylistic sequence is known, they can give a good approximate time period of temple construction. Lintels were decorated in place and were one of the last areas of temples to be decorated. This gives a good approximate end date to a temple's construction. Khmer lintels consist of two parts. Standing on pillars next to a doorway is what is called a true lintel. These are meant to bridge the gap between the pillars, the unit forming a weight-bearing bridge. Post and lintel construction is a very ancient way of bridging gaps, a notable example being the stone circle of Stonehenge. On the front face of the true lintel is the decorative lintel. This lintel rests on the colonnettes. These decorative lintels and their stylistic sequence are the subject of today's video. Although Khmer lintels show a lot of local influence and innovative technique, they were based on Indian forms, so the resemblance between these two sometimes can be quite striking. Over the years, research into the evolution of Khmer lintels has resulted in a chronological sequence based on artistic style and its change over time. This chart, which contains 13 different styles, was based on sandstone lintels with similar characteristics, and which could be linked to a particular place, such as Sambor Pre Cook. The stylistic chart begins in the 7th century, because that is the earliest time period in which Khmer lintels have been found. Before the 7th century, lintels were probably made of wood and have not survived. There are 3 distinct subdivisions in the sequence: pre-Angkorian, which has 3 styles, a transitional or Kulen style, and Angkorian, which has 9 styles. Although the Angkorian period lasted until the 15th century, the chart only goes to the 13th century. That is because after that time, monumental stone Khmer construction ceased with the advent of Theravada Buddhism, an austere branch of Buddhism that does not construct these type of monuments. I will begin with the pre-Angkorian styles. The Sambor Pre Cook and the Pre Khmer styles are similar, and together span most of the 7th century. In both of these styles, there is an arch flowing across the lintel near its top, which is not floral, but which has been speculated to be an imitation of wood. On the arch there are 3 icons or medallions. In the Sambor Pre Cook style, these medallions sometimes contained personages, such as the Hindu god Indra. By the end of the pre-Khmer style, these personages disappear. Hanging from the ark are pendants and looping garlands, and gradually, small leaves begin to fill in the space below. At the extremities of the lintel in the Sambor pre-Cook style are riders on makadas or water monsters. Facing inwards and apparently either spewing or devouring the ends of the arch, the makadas often have lion figures emerging from their open mouths. In the pre-Khmer style, either the end makadas no longer devour the vine and are separate from it, or are replaced by large emblems. In the example you see here, the end carvings have been stolen, which, because of the similarity of these two styles, makes it difficult to ascertain which of the two this lintel represents. The Kampong Preah style, which completely dominated the 8th century, is lacking in almost all the elements of the previous two styles. The curved arch has disappeared, replaced by a floral branch near the center of the lintel. The lintel is completely covered in vegetation, which appears to originate from the central branch itself, and there are no figures or medallions except for a central leafy ornament. The Kulen style of the 9th century, which was marked by the ascent of Jayavarman II to the throne in 802, and which extended through the reign of his son, Jayavarman III, was a transitional phase between the pre-Angkorian and Angkorian periods. The designs on the Kulen style lintels were quite variable and were perhaps a reaction to the relative paucity of figures on the previous Kampong Preah style. Because of this possible nostalgia of the past, elements of the Sambor pre-Cook and pre-Khmer styles, such as makadas and pendants, were reintroduced while keeping the floral background of the Kampong Preah style intact. Kala figures, which had been a minor element in Khmer decoration before, became much more important as lintel's central figures, and remained so until the end of the Angkorian period. Because of the influence of Jayavarman II's possible stay in Java before his return to Cambodia, makata figures from this time onward faced outward from the lintel. Makadas also appear to show some attributes of Cham art, and it is possible that Cham artisans, escaping persecution in their own country to the east, were employed in the decoration of the temples of the Khmer. The Angkorian period began in the 9th century with what I consider to be the apogee of Khmer art. This century featured some of the most distinctive lintels known in the long and colorful history of the Khmer. The Preah style ushered in the Angkorian period. The lintels of the Preah style, which is roughly equivalent to the reign of Indravarman I, who reigned at Harihalalaya, now called Rolos, are considered by many to be the most beautiful of Khmer art. The lintels are deeply carved and are filled with many small figures who pray, dance, hold weapons, or ride horses. The central figures of these lintels generally depict either a deity seated on a kala or a god's vahana, such as Garuda, the vehicle of Vishnu. Preah style makadas, so prevalent in the Kulen style, were sometimes replaced with multi-headed snakes or nagas. These Naga heads, which morphed from the central floral vine, also faced outwards. Reminiscent of earlier styles such as Sambor Pre-Cook, Pre-Angkor style Makatas were complete figures, sometimes with a seated divinity, and being composite mythological animals, the Makatas were often shown with the face of a crocodile, the nose of an elephant, and the body of a lion. Also notable in this style was the frieze at the top of the lintel. In previous styles, the frieze, which shows flowers or praying figures, was part of the lintel block, but beginning in this style, it was carved on a separate block of sandstone. As there had been at the end of the 8th century, in the first half of the 10th century, there was again a tendency to reduce the number of figures carved on the faces of the lintels. The Bakang and the following Khmer styles were rather similar in this respect. Another major change notable in these two styles was the gradual increase in the size of the central figures, the characters of which became very diverse, so that by the Khmer period, they nearly filled the space between the top and the bottom of the lintels. Also at this time, the central vine, which had previously stretched almost horizontally across the lintel, began to dip in the center. Although not pervasive in the 10th century, this tendency to dip would continue over time, so that by the 11th century, the central figures would sit at the bottoms of the lintels. Also at about this time, the end Makatas seemed to lose their importance, and in the next century or so, they are gradually replaced by a scrolling of the ends of the central vine. The mid to late 10th century saw a resurgence of complexity in Khmer lintels, with the back-to-back reigns of Rajavarman II and his son, Jayavarman V. The Pre-Rup style, considered a transitory style by some researchers, and the Bante Sray style, reminiscent of the Pre-Angkor style, revealed diverse motifs that are deeply carved, but not as rich as the latter. The central vine shows pronounced looping and continues to droop in the middle, sometimes actually reaching the bottom of the lintel. The carvings of the Bante Sray style are especially pronounced, owing in large part to the medium on which they were carved. Bante Sray features an especially hard type of beautiful reddish sandstone which has survived erosion especially well over the centuries, leaving us carvings that look almost as if they were carved yesterday. From just before the turn of the 11th century, during the final years of Jayavarman V, to about the middle of the 11th century, there were three kings at Angkor: Udayadityavarman I, Jayaviravarman, and Suryavarman I. Khmer lintels during this time again underwent a regression from the elaborate carvings of the Bante Sray style to a simpler, more restrained look. The central figures on these lintels are exclusively the Kala and its rider, which now sit at or near the bottom of the lintels. The central vine remains convoluted and is sometimes broken up into sections. The middle of the century has been assigned to a transitional phase in which the central Kala sometimes sports a lower jaw. In the Baphuon style, which embodied the reigns of Udayadityavarman II and Harshavarman III of the late 11th century, the rider on Kala motifs continue, the Kalas again sometimes having lower jaws. But there is also the emergence of heraldic or narrative scenes. Perhaps as a harbinger of the coming reign of the Vishnuite king Suryavarman II, sometimes these scenes depict the life of Krishna, a manifestation of the Hindu god Vishnu. The Angkor Wat style lasted for about 100 years, from the late 11th century to the last quarter of the 12th, and spanned the reigns of three kings, Jayavarman VI, Suryavarman II, and Yasovarman II. As the focus of religious devotion at this time shifted from the supreme god Shiva to the worship of the Hindu god Vishnu, temples were built and decorated to reflect this change. Narrative scenes and devata figures of great quality filled temple walls, making this one of the most visually beautiful eras of Khmer art. Perhaps taking note of the visually crowded carvings on Indian temples, bare spaces were avoided when possible, an attitude that almost seemed to be an obsession with Khmer artisans of the time. Lintels reflected this tendency to completely fill all available space, with floral designs tightly curled, kalas mounted by dancing figures, including of course Vishnu, and narrative scenes mirroring the large scenes carved on the temple walls. This was the last great manifestation of the Hindu art form at Angkor, and its devotion to the gods Shiva, Vishnu, and Brahma. For soon would come a major change in religious focus in the Khmer Empire, to Mahayana Buddhism and a new plethora of gods. After 4 years of occupation by the Cham, and their final defeat in 1181, the Khmer Empire was in a shambles. Angkor had to be completely rebuilt, and because Jayavarman VII was Buddhist, the Lintel art forms of this time period showed Buddhist figures instead of Hindu gods atop central Kala figures. Jayavarman initiated a hurried building program, and the architecture and art of his and his son and successor, Indravarman II's reigns reflects this in the rather shoddy techniques employed. Many figures disappeared from lintel surfaces. Generally, only Kala and Buddhist writers sat at the bottom of the lintels, surrounded by foliage. This was the last great period of Khmer religious construction. Many of the Buddhist figures from Jayavarman VII's reign were either erased or recarved into Hindu symbols in the iconoclasm which occurred after Jayavarman's death in about 1220. Some say by Jayavarman VIII, who, though originally Buddhist, reverted to Hinduism. Though there was a post-Bayan architectural style, there is no lintel style for the post-Bayan period, which ranged from about 1243 to the mid-15th century and the fall of Angkor. Very few temples were built during this period, and eventually, with the introduction of Theravada Buddhism, the construction of monumental religious structures at Angkor stopped completely. Now that you have a general idea of the changes in lintel styles over time, it is time to test your knowledge to see what you have learned. I will give you 10 lintels plus 1 bonus lintel to guess by century, style, or temple. And if you can guess any one of the 3, that will count as a correct answer. Good luck, and remember, no cheating by looking ahead at the answers. Thank you for watching, and see you next time at Angkor.